Thank you for joining our workshop webinar series today titled Uncover 5 Hidden Risks That Can Expand Your Cloud Infrastructure Attack Surface. My name is Maura Ghazzani. I run marketing for CloudKnox, and I'll be your moderator and short presenter for the next hour or so. I'm joined by our cloud security experts, Neil Walker and Jim Novak, who will be our main presenters today. In terms of the agenda, I'm going to provide a short overview of the challenges that companies are facing or dealing with today as it relates to managing privileged access across the cloud. Now, Neil and Jim will follow me with a detailed look at the 5 key hidden risks that are often overlooked, and will also include a discussion on some of the mitigation strategies that are not theoretical and are actually based on real-world examples from some of the largest financial, healthcare, and utility companies. Okay, so with that, let's get started. So when you think about the common origins of most security incidents and breaches, I think it's pretty fair to say that most of us probably don't always think about the problem in the context of privileged identities and their access rights to cloud or to cloud resources. But if you look back at some of the biggest breaches over the last few years, the cause was directly related to what we call permission misuse. And it's permission misuse by identities or users that should never have had those permissions in the first place. Now we're starting to see data that supports this trend, such as the one that I have here on the slide from Gartner, that states that by 2023, 75% of security failures will result from inadequate management of identities, access, and privileges, up from 50% this year. So what does that really mean? To us, it means that really cloud security is only as good as an organization's ability to control the level of access identities have to your cloud infrastructure. And since the actions that these identities can take are dictated by the type of permissions that are granted them, protecting against excessive permissions and then quickly responding when those permissions are misused or abused has really become critical. Now, the reality is that the probability of an incident or breach, whether intentional or not, is going to increase greatly for any enterprise that is embracing the cloud. I don't think there's a question there. And we believe the reason for this is that there are multiple forces at play here that are creating what I like to call the perfect storm. And it's the perfect storm for identity permissions misuse. And when I talk about permissions misuse, I'm talking about both accidental, which is actually 80% of the time it's accidental misuse of permissions that cause problems, and the other 20%, which is intentional, a malicious intention. And it's happening at the hands of a growing number of both human and non-human identities. At CloudKnox, we like to refer to this as permission chaos. And it really starts with just the basic, levels of, the unprecedented levels of automation and innovation that has given, companies or enterprises the ability to scale to new heights and agility, efficiency, cost savings, but has also really introduced new threats. And think about the fact that an entire data center can be created or destroyed with one line of script by an authorized or privileged identity. Now, on top of that, think about the level of complexity and the expertise that it takes to effectively manage multiple complex and very, very different authorization models. And when I talk about cloud authorization models, I'm talking about the actual cloud security platforms like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. And then on top of that, you layer on the fact that security and cloud infrastructure teams are being asked to keep up with the proliferation of new permissions that are now in the tens of thousands. New roles, new policies, new resources, and identities. And again, identities being both human and non-human. In fact, the prediction is that within 5 years, the ratio of machines to humans will increase from 5-to-1 to 20-to-1. And that introduces a whole new set of challenges and obviously requires a webinar just to talk about that topic. Now, most, if not all enterprises we've worked with, they're very well aware of how vulnerable they are, especially as they compare their own cloud security programs to some of the most sophisticated enterprise security programs in the world. But if you look at recent breaches, even those companies have fallen victim to major attacks. So as I just mentioned, the number of permissions that organizations are being asked to manage is growing daily and is estimated to be around 40,000 across the 4 key cloud platforms that I just mentioned. And that number keeps on growing. What is concerning is that of those 40,000 permissions, over 50% are considered high risk. And that implies that they could cause catastrophic damage if any of those permissions are used improperly, or a combination of those permissions are used improperly. What we also discovered at CloudKnox, and this is based on over 100 plus assessments that we've performed, is that over 95% of privileged identities were grossly over permissioned and obviously could adversely impact the infrastructure. We also discovered that these identities were using less than 10% of the permissions that they had been granted, effectively leaving the other 90% of unused permissions wide open to exploitation. This dangerous delta that I just described between permissions granted and permissions used is what we call the cloud permissions gap. And of course, the larger the gap, the larger and more menacing is the attack surface. And really, to properly address this gap, we believe that you need to tackle those hidden risks that are actually creating it. Which brings me to the next slide in the more technical part of this presentation. So at CloudKnox, we've defined what we consider 5 commonly overlooked identity-centric risks that we believe, if not addressed on a continuous basis, it's not a one-time project, on a continuous basis, it'll wreak havoc on your cloud infrastructure. And we've seen it time and time again. And with that, I'm going to hand the baton over to Neil, who will take you through the first 3 risks, which are inactive identities, super identities, and over-permissioned active identities. Then Jim will walk us through cross-account access and anomalous behavior. All right, take it over, Neil. Thanks.
Thanks, Maura. The first risk we're going to discuss is inactive identities. These are human and non-human identities whose permissions have not been utilized or haven't been utilized for a long time. In most cases, this isn't a few permissions that are laying dormant. This is thousands of permissions with the ability to perform high-risk tasks that are left orphaned. These are not just human identities like users and groups. These are roles, these are service accounts, these are resources. When we look in an organization's environment, we always find huge percentages of inactive identities. This is common for a lot of reasons. It's not just cases where identities have been left inactive because an employee is no longer with the organization. That's one reason tied to inactivity that's based on a human identity. But there's many more examples, right? I mean, we see this all the time when organizations are transitioning, they have new projects, they're transitioning, for example, to a new SSO or SAML provider, right? It sounds harmless. In fact, they're moving in that direction to move away from local users, to add MFA, to potentially close some security gaps. They assume they're in good shape. When we give them the visibility into their activity, they notice that while they're moving away from local users and groups is a good thing, they still leave those same inactive local users and groups orphaned. These identities almost always have high-risk permissions laying dormant. Many organizations simply aren't aware of the implications that we're going to discuss in a few minutes, or they don't have easy access to persistently identify this inactivity. Another example we constantly see is when customers kick off projects and they receive guidance from third-party vendors regarding what they need for permissions, whether it's in the context of a role for AWS or a service account for GCP and Azure. In nearly every customer environment, they have forgotten or overlooked these service accounts and roles that were created for POCs or other projects that have long since been terminated. It's not until these organizations get that holistic visibility into their environment, they can easily find these orphan service accounts and roles. The next risk I want to discuss is super identities. Super identities are both human and non-human identities with an admin role. Why do they exist and why are they so important? In the legacy data center paradigm, it was easy to enforce the separation of duties and the principle of least privilege because whether you were a server admin, a network admin, a desktop admin, your authority to perform actions was limited to your job function. In most cases, you wouldn't see an overlap in responsibilities. Even if the server admin were to misuse his privileges either accidentally or maliciously, the damage would have been contained. That same admin under the new cloud paradigm with all the cloud authorization platforms, all the automation that comes with that can destroy an entire data center with a couple of clicks or a simple script. Super identities can be both human and non-human. These aren't the legacy break glass admin accounts that you used to from the legacy data center days. So super identity visibility across the entire environment is critical, right? To truly understand security postures, organizations must have a holistic view of who can access what and how they are attributing these permissions, especially the non-human identities that are growing at an incredible rate in all the cloud environments. Think about how exponentially the risk increases if a machine identity falls into the wrong hands, like a service account, a bot, an EC2 instance, a serverless function. When we're working with organizations, I almost always see an EC2 instance in an environment that can assume a role, get full admin access into production. This instance could access all your storage buckets. No one was aware of it. They just don't have the visibility to persistently pick these security gaps up. I recently had a super identity flagged in an enterprise that contained a role with a vendor name. It was a solution that you wouldn't think would lend itself or require administrator or high-risk permissions. Ultimately, what we discovered was the vendor asked them to deploy a role with a custom policy. They didn't inspect it. When it was flagged, we found this custom policy that effectively granted admin access was identical to an AWS managed policy. The expectation with a custom policy in that case was that it was already scoped down, so they ignored it. But that wasn't the case. If you lack the visibility, these gaps go unchecked. This type of granular visibility, reporting, alerting is critical to understanding these risks. The next risk, over-permissioned active identities, is simply more permissions than identities need to perform their day-to-day tasks. We still see customers assigning permissions based on an employee's job function. That's driven entirely by assumption. That still leaves, in most cases, thousands of additional permissions, including high-risk tasks, left unused. It's that legacy approach of static role-based access controls to enforce the principle of least privilege. It ends up giving identities access to privileges they just don't need. When customers understand they can scope down these permissions based on what these identities have actually used, their activity, they immediately realize they can strengthen their security posture. Every environment we look at, we see huge percentages of over-permissioned active identities. The permissions gap is massive. These aren't inflated numbers. This permission gap, these numbers are extremely common. When we take a holistic look at an organization's environment, if we see more than 1 or 2% of granted permissions being utilized, that's out of the norm. In addition to the numbers, a huge percentage of these granted unused tasks are high risk. Why give identities the ability to delete virtual machines in Azure, EC2 instances in AWS, invoke data center to destroy in vCenter if they've never used the task? Even in those cases where you might have guardrails in place for a few high-risk tasks, how do you ensure there are no permissions allowing the identity to elevate their own permissions? Do you even know what identities can elevate permissions in your environment? In most cases, we see that organizations just completely lack that visibility. So let's talk a little bit about the implications. Inactive identities specifically pose an unnecessary, avoidable risk from credential compromise and malicious intent. It's avoidable risk. Most organizations, they agree they would do something about it if they had the holistic visibility, if they understood where to start. Over-permissioned active identities have the ability to delete your storage buckets, delete your servers. They can completely disrupt your business processes. They haven't used the permissions. Why do they have that ability? Not scoping down resource permissions can result in even a larger attack surface. When I talk to organizations, most of them can't tell me who has the ability to delete all your EC2 instances or storage buckets. What EC2 instances have S3 full access? This is a massive attack surface, and it's the fundamental vehicle bad actors have harnessed to carry out some of the most malicious breaches that we've seen in the press over the course of the last year. So let's talk a little bit about mitigation strategies. From a mitigation standpoint, what should you do? Start by making the visibility actionable. Start with visibility, move towards mitigation. Scope down the permissions or remove your inactive identities. Whether it's a user, group, role, service account, create customized roles or policies based on that identity's activity. If they aren't using a high-risk task, remove it. Get alerted or receive scheduled reports to prioritize the ongoing privilege creep. Once your environment is right-sized, to support those use cases when an identity needs elevated permissions, whether it's emergency maintenance, weekend migrations, you're a contract worker, a seasonal worker, whatever the use cases, organizations need a requester approver self-grant workflow to give them those permissions for a set period of time. Whether it's immediately for a few hours, on a recurring basis for weeks or months, requesting those permissions on demand will help really constrict your attack surface. So how do you perform mitigation, right? Organizations need supported admin workflows or APIs for their mitigation requirements. They need an interface and automation that details the process intuitively and easily to create custom roles or policy based on the users, the service accounts, the group or role activity. They also need a vehicle to provide permissions on demand, right? Or a just-in-time workflow that supports an organization's multi-cloud environment. Give them the same requester approval workflow across the entire environment. If they already have a requester approver self-grant workflow in place, then extend that to that ITSM, either natively via API, right? To request that temporary access to those high-risk tasks. I'm now going to hand it off to Jim, who's going to talk to you about cross-account access.
Yep, thanks, Neil. The fourth risk here is cross-account access. It exists in many AWS environments. Cross-account access allows an external identity to access an account or an internal identity to access different environments. An external identity could be a third-party cybersecurity tool or possibly an MSP managing your cloud infrastructure, whereas an internal identity could be your developers or your cloud admins or even non-human identities such as serverless functions or EC2 instances or even security audit roles. Here's a sample showing the extended reach of a cross-account role. Notice that within the sandbox environment, a dev role exists that has full administrator access to the CNX sandbox account. Several identities from the CloudKnox development account can assume this role. Also, identities from the production account, 13265, etc., can assume roles into CloudKnox development, which in turn can assume roles into CNX sandbox. This may be okay in some environments, but we have also seen the opposite workflow be available, where an identity in a sandbox account can role chain through development and access production resources. This scenario certainly is not okay. I know some of you may be thinking cross-account access is not a risk, it's a requirement or a necessity, and in most AWS environments, this is true. However, where a cross-account role becomes a risk is when it's not maintained or it's not monitored. Many cross-account roles are over-provisioned with far too many permissions than are needed. These overly permissive roles will allow access into an account that may not be necessary and can potentially cause a loss of control within that account. For example, those of you that are using SCP policy, a quick, easy 5-line script could deny access to your entire organization and all the sub-accounts within that organization using a malicious SCP deny command. This is also true in heavily automated environments. Infrastructure could be spun up and down via Lambda function using a cross-account role into one or more accounts. This could be limited by reducing the services that have access to that role. We have seen this scenario play out in many of our risk assessments. There are also legacy or stale cross-account roles that have access to resources they no longer need. This could be a security tool from a third-party account that was evaluated, a no longer needed, or possibly a security assessment that required elevated cross-account access during a short window to perform an incident response type test. These accounts get left behind. They're very powerful. We have seen this a lot in some of the most sophisticated environments. When we plan to mitigate the risks associated with cross-access accounts, the easiest approach is to disable or delete any inactive cross-account roles over the last 90 days. A second strategy would be to limit the identities from which a cross-account role is accessed. When creating the role, do not open it to all identities from another account or provide root level type access. You can customize the ARN to restrict the access to the specific identity coming from that account. Finally, as you move towards a least privilege model, limit the permissions of the cross-account role to read-only type activities. As these roles need additional higher risk or delete type permissions, they can be added in a just-in-time or privilege on demand method with resource and time-bound constraints so that the role returns to a read-only state after the work requiring that additional permission has been completed. Risk number 5, anomalous behavior. In its simplest form, anomalous behavior occurs when a human or non-human identity's access pattern changes in relation to their historical activity. Depending on whether or not activity is normal due to, say, a change in job role, or if it's malicious behavior, requires automation. An identity that is suddenly executing a high-risk task or accessing critical resources that had never been accessed before can potentially be malicious. When you think of an identity and the pattern of activity associated with that identity, generally speaking, that pattern of activity will be consistent over time. It is when the outliers occur or that pattern of activity changes, the anomaly occurs. For example, an identity that had never downloaded data from every S3 bucket in your environment over a very short period of time would definitely be an anomalous behavior with a high probability of being malicious. Other critical resources being accessed or a permission being used for the first time could be a new hire or a new function that had not attempted that action in the first 90 days, or most likely it is a discovery or reconnaissance attempt to understand the reach of an identity. Also, most identities will access resources from the same IP address or the same range of IP addresses on a regular basis and within a known time window during the day. When you start to see activity from known bad IP addresses outside of the usual access hours is when you start to see anomalies occur. Additionally, conditions like impossible time travel, simultaneous access attempts from 2 different countries, multiple access attempts or multiple failed access attempts in a short time window should be investigated as anomalous as well. Mitigating anomalous behavior requires an understanding of known good and known bad behavior. This behavior profile takes time to create, typically, as we've mentioned, 90 days. Right? After usage patterns are monitored, analyzed, and understood, here are a few strategies to help mitigate anomalies. Number 1, you will know the time of day and resource access usage of that given identity. You can then create an access permissions that will only allow an identity in based on its historical usage. This will limit the access window and prevent outlier access activity based on time and usage. Number 2, alerts. Investigate all anomaly alerts. Yes, there will be new employees. Yes, there will be new applications that access resources for the first time, but the anomalous alerts will not occur for 90 days. So any first type alerts that are happening after this 90-day analysis period should be investigated. Finally, take automated actions to lock down. Even if the real Neil Walker is on vacation in Russia, using a laptop that was not his to access valid resources, this activity will trigger an outlier detection and should force an automated action. Locking down access and critical resources is necessary when extreme anomalies like this occur. In the event that the anomaly was in fact created by an authentic user, Neil in this case, Self-mitigation options are available for a user to remove themselves from lockdown. In this session, we discussed the 5 hidden risks that can expand your cloud infrastructure attack surface. By looking at each of these risks and following the recommended mitigation strategies, organizations can significantly reduce the surface area of an attack and protect critical resources and data. If you quickly review the mitigation strategies on the screen, you'll notice that all of them have a focus on closing the permissions gap and removing unused permissions based on normal activities. Inactive identities and permissions are considered security debt and should be cleaned up. Super identities, or commonly referenced super admins, need to be extremely limited, right? And the practice of handing out super identities freely needs to end. Over-permissioned identities, which are not necessarily super administrators, but still have more permissions than are needed, must be reduced as well. Cross-account access control will limit your blast radius and control lateral movement within your environment. And finally, anomaly behavior based on activity should be monitored, alerted, and mitigated over time. I'd like to pass the ball back to Maura for closing comments.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Neil. So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we've done definitely over 100, probably in the 120 number in terms of assessments at CloudKnox. And without exception, we've uncovered all the risks that we talked about today, plus a lot more. And we've really uncovered them, across every industry and every size of enterprise. So it doesn't matter if you're small, it doesn't matter what vertical you belong to. You basically see this across every industry and every size of enterprise. Now, if you're interested in finding out how big your cloud permissions gap and uncovering some of the hidden risks in your infrastructure, I'd like to invite you to sign up for our free, no obligation risk assessment. It really requires very little time. It takes no more than 30 minutes to set it up. And then pretty much we can deliver what we call a permissions analytics report within 24 hours and present it back to you and your team. Thank you again, Jim and Neil, for this very interesting and informative discussion. If there are questions that you have after, or you want to send us an email, we'll get right back to you with answers. And then on behalf of everyone, thank you for joining the CloudKnox webinar workshop series, and have a great rest of the day. And more importantly, please stay safe.